From Atlanta, Georgia, welcome to Fearfully and Wonderfully Me, a podcast for women on leadership and life skills with Rhea Story. Rhea shares powerful life and leadership principles, helping you maximize your potential and become the woman God created you to be.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's podcast episode. I am super excited to be doing this podcast episode. I've been working really hard over the last couple of months on a new book and just wanted to do a brief podcast to introduce the concept of uh, the content of the book and the concept of the book, and then maybe a few podcasts to kind of dig into some of the key points that I've been working on and putting into the book. So, introducing my latest book is The Ladder of Influence, and we'll be releasing probably the last week of February or the first couple weeks of March. So super excited. That's just around the corner. I've been working on that most of the winter, on and off. If you've been listening to the podcast, you know, Mac and I took a few weeks of much needed vacation. But as soon as we got back from vacation last year in the fall, then I went right to work on all the things I needed to do to catch up, and then working on this book, particularly heavy through January. So it has been a work in progress, but as always, when I work on something like this, when I write a new book, one of the things I love about it is it just gives me the opportunity to think really differently into things and concepts and principles, and maybe think of things with a different perspective or a new perspective. And that's absolutely the case here. So very, very excited about this new concept. And the whole theme, the ladder of influence, really comes from, I use the framework of influence as a ladder because it's clear to all of us there are different degrees of influence, right? You influence people using leadership and influence principles, but how you apply those principles is very different based on your relationship with the person, right? You don't try to influence your boss in the same way you try to influence your kids, for example. And so that's very clear. There are different degrees of influence, how much we can influence one person or another. And you know, influence is incredibly dynamic because you can get a little influence just from having a title or a position of authority. But that type of influence is very limited because people who follow you only because they have to only do what they have to. So I really am not concerned about that concept in this new book. In this book, I primarily focus on authentic influence. That is, influence based on who you are as a person and how you interact with people and the relationships you have with others. So there again, it's clear that there are different degrees of influence, and I use the framework of a ladder because the degrees of influence stack on top of one another. So you can build influence with people around you simply because you're proactive, or you can lose influence if you don't. So I call that foundational step on the ladder of influence control of self. And again, just want to kind of give you a highlight or overview of this concept and this framework because I see this ladder of influence as a 5 step framework that you can use to climb to increase your influence in any given situation. So, kind of wanted to give you an overview of that. And there again, maybe a few podcasts to drill down into some of the key points of the actual steps. So, first and foremost step on the ladder is control of self, right? It's easy to understand when you consider. I bet you've never had someone lose their temper and yell at you, and you thought, man, I love you a lot more now, right? No. No, you probably are like, I don't trust you as much because you lost your temper and yelled at me. Or I don't trust you as much because you blamed me for a mistake. Or I don't have as much trust and you don't have as much influence because you could not control yourself and your emotions, right? That's just the way it works. You've never trusted somebody more because they got mad and blamed you, right? The answer to that question would be no. So having control of ourselves, and I've talked a lot about being proactive. That's one of the things I'm very focused on because we do have emotions, but they don't have to determine us, right? It's normal and it's natural to have emotions. That's part of being human, but they don't have to determine us. Learning how to control ourselves when those emotions are bubbling up. Now, the second step on the ladder of influence is character, right? We influence people based on who we are, not what we do at this level. It's who we are. And you can have influence with different people at different degrees based on that because it's based on the relationship. So, generally, you are moving to a higher degree of influence as you climb higher on the ladder. And that's based on the first step, control of self. And then the second step is influence based on character development. So, growing yourself, who you are as a person. And I've done a lot of podcasts on ways to do that or ideas on how to do that. But that's the second step, right? Who I am as a person. Once I have control of myself, who I am as a person, my values, my um, integrity, the soft skills, quote unquote, my ability to get along with people, things like that. My character development is determining level of influence at this step. Now, the third step is based on competency, right? The skills that we have. And in the book, I kind of drill down onto how each of these steps play out, both at home and at work. And obviously, a little bit more of our competency comes into play, right? Our skill set is more applicable for a professional environment, but there's also some application at home. And in the book, I talk about the differences and the different scenarios and how that plays out and give you some very specific steps or checklists so that you can use these to navigate the framework for yourself in your situation. So, back to step three, competency. So, for example, if you're excellent at what you do and you have a reputation as being a subject matter expert or you have years of experience, you'll have a degree of influence with someone who comes to you for help at work. Right? That's based on your competency, the skills, the knowledge, the technical ability that you have. That brings with it a level of influence if you first climb the first two steps, right? It doesn't matter how highly skilled of an expert you are, if you cannot control yourself and control your emotions, you're not going to be successful in a professional environment. People will admire your skills, but they'll be like, well, every time something doesn't go his way, then he or she is laying on the floor kicking and screaming like a 2-year old. Like, that's not going to take you very far in a professional setting. So each step of the ladder has to be climbed successively, progressively, and you never get to leave behind one of those steps because they are foundational and you step one to step two to step three, right? And so on. The fourth step on the ladder of influence, I see this as commitment to developing others. And this is someone who has poured into you, perhaps has mentored you, they have a high degree of influence with you. Maybe they have counseled you or given you good advice, even if it meant you moved on beyond your current situation, or maybe this was, a mentor at work, but they developed you even if that meant you could move on to a different position or a different place in the organization or a different organization, right? A high degree of influence with someone is based on a commitment to developing others because it's the sacrifice, right? It's pouring into someone, sharing what I've learned and the lessons, and mentoring someone, and that strengthens the relationship because that's about not just success for the individual, but success in the life of someone else, significance in the life of someone else. And you can't simply jump to the top step. You can't simply jump to the fourth step on the ladder of influence. You have to start climbing from the bottom. And the fifth step, at the top step that I see on the ladder of influence, is the contribution of service over time. And I won't drill into that very deeply for purposes of this podcast episode, but basically, this is someone who has done what they've done for so long for so many people and touched so many lives that someone at this level is influencing based on that contribution of service over a length of time, right? This is legacy. These are people who change many lives all over. So, our authentic influence is based on relationships, and this takes time to develop it. That's why it takes time for us to develop more influence with people. And anytime, I think I've said this before, but anytime I'm talking about influence, I'm talking about positive influence. Now, absolutely, influence can be negative, and there are a lot of very effective influencers who use their influence in a negative way. And I'm not talking about those principles. I'm not going to even worry about principles that help you build influence to manipulate people. I'm only interested in sharing the principles that help you build positive influence in a way that helps lift you up and helps lift other people up, right? The difference is whether our influence is used to control and manipulate or to inspire and motivate, right? Do I want to manipulate you because I want to take advantage of you, or do I want to motivate you because I want you to be successful for you? So, you know, the principles in this book absolutely can apply if you are in a position of authority, if you have a title in your job or a role. Maybe you're a team leader or manager or supervisor. But but really, the principles in this book are talking about influence at a way that the individual applies that, even if they're not in a position of authority, right? Every single one of us want more influence. And again, in the book, I drill down on each step on the influence ladder, on the ladder of influence, and how it applies at work and how it applies at home. So, both a personal example and a professional example. So, that kind of gives you some practical applications, because I really love, I really love the how do we do things. I mean, theory is great, but when it comes down to it, I want to know how. I want to sit down and be like, well, okay, walk me through one, two, three. How can I use this principle? And so that's what I like to do in the book, is drill down to some practical applications to make it simple and easy to understand, and therefore easier to apply, right? Because once we break it down into something simple, it's much more easier to see how it can be applied to each of our own individual situations, because everyone's different. Everyone is different. Every person is in a different place, personally or professionally. But realizing that this concept of influence being a ladder you can climb, it's a framework that's a 5-step framework that says, okay, here's how I start to gain influence. Number one, I start at the bottom, control of self. And that is foundational. Until we start to master that, it's going to be really difficult to influence other people at a high level. Henry Ward Beecher said, hold yourself responsible for a higher standard than anybody expects of you, and never excuse yourself. Um, and Stephen Covey talks about, when something happens, human beings have the freedom to choose their response. And that's really where that foundational level comes into. So I want to drill down a little bit more into that in the next couple of episodes. And there again, give you kind of some overview of these concepts as I've been working through them and thinking about them as I write the book. I'm always able to think deeply about them and see how they apply. It's one of the beautiful things about writing and working on a book. So, super, super excited to be drilling down into that into the next few podcast episodes to kind of give you some practical tips. And of course, if you want to dig deeper, then the book will be coming out in just a couple of weeks. You can actually already go ahead and pre order that. If that's something that interests you, you can already go ahead and get a pre order a signed copy. That's just go to theladderofinfluence.com, and that will take you to a button where the link on the website where you can pre-order your signed copies. Until next time. I hope you've enjoyed this short podcast episode, which is an excerpt from my new book, The Ladder of Influence, releasing March of 2023. You can go ahead and pre-order your signed copies now. They are available for pre-order by going to theladderofinfluence.com, and near the bottom of the screen, you'll see a button to pre-order your signed copies. See you next time.